So thank you all for joining us today. This is Julia Roig. I'm the president of Partners Global, and this is the fourth in a series of webinars that we've had to discuss resiliency for civil society. And over the months, this topic of resiliency has really been evolving for us as an organization and as a network. And if you aren't familiar with Partners and our network, we have affiliated nonprofits who share a brand around the world: Partners Georgia, Partners Colombia, Partners Yemen. And we jointly worked on creating a framework for civil society resiliency with some adjacent fields and peer networks over a period of about 3 years, investing in a framework of how civil society organizations who are working under very difficult political circumstances, initially thinking of closing civic space in particular as a term for those environments that aren't especially friendly to civil society that is performing its function in a kind of democratic system. And yet now the application of our resiliency framework and the factors that contribute to continuing to maintain operations, to thrive and survive, have taken on a whole new meaning as we confront a global pandemic. And now in the United States, just a level of unrest and violence that is kind of shaking all of us to our core. And so one of the factors of 7 that I'm also most personally passionate about is narrative competency. And this is, narrative now has become a bit of a sexy topic in our field. And I'm really grateful to have somebody who I consider just an inspirational expert on the topic, Nat, who is the CEO of Frameworks, and I'm not going to give him a big introduction, but to say that, what our commitment to narrative competency as a part of civil society resiliency isn't necessarily good storytelling, and it's not just strategic communications or even crisis communications. It's really the way that we're engaging our audiences with curiosity about how we as a sector are potentially contributing to a better understanding of the policies that we want to put forward, the values that we hold, and how there's a science behind the way that people make meaning out of the world and their identities. And there are social scientists who study this way of making meaning, the framing of issues, and the way that narratives inform the way that our mental models absorb information. And so that was my very not technical description. We're going to have somebody much better at this tell you more, but I wanted to say that my journey as the head of a nonprofit organization around narrative competency is really one of like self-reflection. And so the one that why I wanted to invite Nat to talk about narrative competency at this moment isn't necessarily so that we can focus so much on changing others to think differently and combat, toxic narratives. There's all of this combating, violent extremism. But thank you for letting me know. I'm looking around and not at you guys at the camera. But that essentially what we want is for us to jointly reflect about the role that we play in communicating to an audience that helps to increase understanding and also hopefully is restorative of relationships. So I'm going to turn this over to Nat to talk a little bit more about how they think about framing, some of the research that they've done and how it can be useful and helpful to this very global audience. I want to tell you, we have almost 20 different countries that signed up for this webinar. And it's been a privilege to participate actively in partnership with Frameworks on a research initiative that we're doing in the United States right now, looking at how we can frame a peace building agenda and a foreign policy imperative in the US, and how we might better bring an audience to that issue. So we're actually working with Frameworks very actively at this exact moment on applying some of these research methodologies to how we can sell peace and frame peace to have more people really kind of believe in that and support the policies that we're trying to work towards. So thank you so much, Nat, for being with us. I'm really thrilled that you took time. If folks have any questions for Nat, we're going to let him just present for the first 30 minutes or so. And then please put in the chat, not the Q&A, but the chat function. I'll be compiling some of those questions, and we'll end the last 20 minutes and bring forward those questions for you. So thank you for being with us. And with that, Nat, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. This is a pretty cool opportunity to talk to people from a whole bunch of different countries and to share some work and some thinking that I've been doing for 20 years, but really intensely and in a different way over the last 3 months. So I'm excited to get to talk to you about framing. As Julia knows, it's my all-time absolute most favorite thing to do, which is kind of sad and pathetic that I get that excited about framing. But I have to say that framing does feel particularly important in the world that we're living in and in the context that we're facing, whether that be the pandemic or this really salient issue of racial justice, racial violence in the United States right now. So I want to thank you to Julia and for Partners for having me on. And then I want to thank each and every one of you who's on the webinar right now for your time. I know everyone's time is incredibly valuable. And I appreciate you choosing to spend some of it with Julie and I today here. And in exchange for that time, I will do my best, my absolute best, to try to, in return for your time, to try to provide some value to the work that you're doing. And that's really my one and only goal for the next 42 minutes, 52 minutes, is to be helpful to you all. I hope that I can take the work that I've done and my colleagues do at Frameworks and bring it to you all in a way that gives you some new perspectives, some new things to think about, and hopefully some new, really concrete and specific practices to try in your work. And I hope that we can do that. I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about myself, not because I think you care or you should care or that it's all that important, but where I come from, my background, is actually really important to the kind of work that I'm going to be talking about today. So I am going to be talking about framing and narrative and communications, but I'm not a communications person by background. I'm an anthropologist. I do a kind of anthropology that's called psychological anthropology, which means that I am interested in and study the way that culture influences how people think, how we all use culture to make meaning of information, to process messages, and to formulate and reach decisions. And I'm lucky to get to do this work on culture and, as Julia said, meaning making and framing with about 30 other really committed social scientists of various disciplines, people who are anthropologists, but also sociologists and linguists and social psychologists. And we do two things, both of which I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. We study how people think about complex social issues like criminal justice and immigration and addiction and public health. And then we study how the way that we talk about those issues affects what people think and feel and do when it comes to those issues. And that second thing is really the science of framing, where I'm going to focus most of my time today. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to very quickly at the outset here kind of reset us all and provide a common foundation for what this term, this word framing means. It is one of these, like narrative change, one of these words that I fear has become so ubiquitous and overused that it has lost any and all meaning that it ever once had. So we're gonna build ourselves a common definition to kind of have as a platform for this discussion. And then I'm gonna take you through 6 ideas, 6 things that I've been thinking about a lot, again, for a long time, but I think that are especially important and of consequence in the context of the pandemic over the last 2.5 to 3 months. And I also think things that are in the moment today that we are in the United States, with unrest around really deep, pernicious issues of racial violence and systemic racism, ideas that are really important for right here and right now. And then we'll take some questions afterwards. So when we say framing for the next 40 minutes or so, what we mean is the way in which the choices that we make as communicators and how we present information have effects on how people think, how they feel, and what they're willing to do as a result. So really simply, it's the variations in how information is presented and how those variations have effects on people's perceptions and frequently on their behaviors. So I'm going to give you a quick example from a seminal piece of research that was conducted in the early 2000s, 2004, I believe, by 2 social psychologists that really kind of clearly encapsulates and represents this concept of framing. So what these 2 social scientists did, these social psychologists did, was they recruited a large representative sample of Americans. They split the sample in half. Half of the respondents, half of the participants received this message that you see on the screen right now, which is information about whether or not someone's in support of allowing a hate group to hold a political rally. And the words that you see in bold are really the way this is framed, kind of what people are told this activity is about. The second half of the sample receives the same information, the same ask, but as you can see, the frame is different. So in the first case, people are entering this conversation through the idea of the importance of free speech. In the second message, people are entering this conversation. It's being framed for them through the idea of risk of violence, danger, threat. And then everyone, irrespective of which frame they received, is asked to indicate whether or not they would be supportive of having this particular group participate in this political activity, hold this rally. And those people who received the information through the frame of the importance of free speech are very supportive, largely supportive of this activity. 85% of the people from this group indicated that they were in support of allowing this activity to take place. And you can probably all see where this is going. When the same information is presented but framed through danger and threat rather than free speech, the resulting support for the activity is reduced by more than half. So really clearly shows you that the way that we present information is not just kind of purple prose and flowery language that adorns our ideas, but is actually really important in determining whether our ideas can have the impact, can have the influence, can have the effect that we want them to as strategic communicators. So Julia will know this, but I talk and think a lot about metaphors, and I've come to this metaphor of a key of kind of an opening function to think about framing. And we have seen, and I'll show you throughout the presentation, the way in which frames and the way that we present our information can have this really powerful effect of opening space to have people think about new ideas, to have new conversations, to increase support for solutions, to allow people to see issues from different perspectives. But we've also seen, and I'll talk about today, the way in which framing can really lock up space. It can shut down conversations. It can reduce the ability for people to think about new ideas. It can close down conversation. It can splinter, and really kind of powerfully polarize thinking in some really, I would argue, unproductive, counterproductive, and dangerous ways. So I'll be talking about this idea of kind of frames as an opening device, as a key that can really allow us to create a context in which our ideas can be more productively received and engaged with, and we can be more effective as communicators. And I think we all know, and I said this at the beginning, that framing has always mattered. I think since the beginning of communication and cognition, but I think it really, really matters right now. And I've been collecting examples of frames and kind of analyzing their effects over the last 2.5 months. And I just want to show you a couple of the ones that I've identified as being particularly interesting. Not particularly good, all of them, but really clear examples of the way that people have made decisions about how to present information are having significant effects on people's thinking, on people's feeling, and on people's behavior as a result. So the one that has become, I think, almost a cliche at this point, which was used at the beginning, it's kind of dropped out of discourse, is this idea, this way in which the coronavirus, in which COVID-19 was presented as the Chinese virus. And we saw it really powerfully, and there's lots of work in the social sciences that underlies this, that when a frame is presented like this, it has some pretty strong and immediate impacts in how we think and perceive, particularly in and out groups. So when this is framed as the Chinese virus, we become immediately fearful and want to distance ourselves from whatever group has been otherized. In this case, largely Americans of Asian background descent. And we become very nationalistic and kind of exclusionary in our focus. It immediately sets up this really powerful us and them perspective. And I think it's a good, fair argument to make that it doesn't just make people racist against the particular group of people that this frame is aimed at, but rather it creates an us and them and a kind of xenophobic perspective that unfortunately bleeds and spills out into how we think about all kinds of other groups which constitute society. So I'm really interested right now in the way that we've framed issues around COVID and the pandemic are actually setting up and fueling some of the discourse around racial violence and the way that it's kind of polarized and politicized. Another one of my favorites in this case in not a good way is the way, and this continues to this day, but the way in which the public health measures that were advised were clearly framed using this, which you see in quotes here on the screen, this idea that these were draconian measures. And this has a really strong, and I would argue very intentional effect in creating the perception that anything that's labeled with draconian, preceded by draconian, is seen as an overreaction. And as soon as people perceive it in this way, they become very hesitant to receive information and very resistant to acting based on that information. So it has a clear effect, again, just by the use of words in terms of how we behave and the actions that we choose to follow and those that we reject. And these first two, I think, are, I think Chinese virus in particular is very blunt. It's very clear as a framing device, and also really apparent in terms of its negative effects, its unproductive effects, its dangerous effects in terms of public thinking. The third one here is, I think, equally important, but more subtle and nuanced. And that is all of the discussion that we've been seeing in this country, but in other countries as well, around what we call vulnerability framing. So discussions about the need to protect the most vulnerable people in society, the most at-risk populations. And I think most of the times in which this kind of framing is used is for good intentions, right? People are using this to highlight the need for greater support for policies that address the needs of particular groups of the population. But in actuality, there's a really strong body of social science that shows that this vulnerability framing is actually really dangerous, in that it invites people to instantly other. No one considers themselves vulnerable. So as soon as you've labeled a group of people as vulnerable, we are highly adept at creating distance and othering that group of people. It creates zero-sum thinking. So whereby any more for you and yours, for those vulnerable, and I'm using my pronouns really intentionally here, those vulnerable people over there, by definition, then means less for me and my people over here. And we've also seen a really powerful way in which vulnerability framing contributes to stereotypes and stigmas of certain groups of people, and in a really interesting way, not only how other groups think about a group that's been labeled as vulnerable, but also how people in the population that's been labeled as vulnerable think about and kind of self-stigmatize themselves and have their own perceptions of their identity significantly affected by this kind of framing. So as I said, these are 3 examples of how we've seen framing in really powerful ways recently, but it has always mattered. I'm going to show you one other quick example, and I've picked this intentionally because it does have some bearing both on pandemic-related issues, but also issues of systemic racism and racial violence that's going on right now. So this is a piece of work that we've conducted on, we've done a lot of work on framing children's issues, children and families issues. In this work, our task has been to figure out ways of framing issues of early childhood and early childhood development to get people to be more supportive of public policies that would support child well-being, positive child development, child mental health. And so in this particular experiment, we recruited a large sample, representative sample of Americans, representative in all the demographic categories that you can think of, and randomly assigned each of slightly more than 6,000 people to 2 different messages. So the messages are what you see along the horizontal axis of the graph in front of you. So some people are randomly assigned to the message, the frame of future progress and social prosperity, in which they'd read about a fictitious program that's designed to support child mental health in the United States. And they're presented at the very beginning of that description with one sentence that kind of primes this frame, in this case, of value. So they'd read something like, it's important that we do a better job of supporting children's mental health because, and we wouldn't say it in this way, children are our future, right? Their solid mental health, their healthy development determines the ability for us as a society to move forward and to be prosperous in the future. Another group is randomly assigned to the vulnerability frame, in which case they read the same information about the program. The only thing that's different is that the lead sentence is, instead of being about future progress and social prosperity, it would read something like, it's important that we do a better job of addressing child mental health because children are our most vulnerable citizens, and as such, they deserve our empathy and our compassion. So the only difference between these 2 things that people are reading are about 10 to 15 words in the first sentence, the frame through which they enter the conversation, through which they encounter this information. And then everybody, irrespective of which message, which frame they're exposed to, answers a set of questions that are designed to measure how supportive they are of a set of evidence-based policies, of policies that the field advocates for as being really effective and important in improving child mental health and supporting healthy development. And so what you're going to see on this next click are what I personally think are absolutely gorgeous green bars are going to appear on the screen. And what those are going to show you is the degree to which hearing these frames affects people's support for policy. And so you see 2 green bars and you notice 2 things. So I don't know about the statistical acumen of the group of folks who's on the phone, but all you need to know for this particular graph is that up is good and down is not good. So the value of future progress, social prosperity is making people to a statistically significant degree more supportive of those policies, more likely to endorse the kind of things that the field is advocating for. Unfortunately, those people who receive the value of vulnerability, for whom the program information is primed with this frame of vulnerability, become less willing, less likely to support those policies. The really interesting thing is that in a subsequent piece of analysis where we looked at all the field's external facing materials over a 3-year period, so the websites, the op-eds, the press releases, the pamphlets, everything that the field was doing designed for an external audience, the value of vulnerability was used as the lead frame in over 90% of those materials. So in essence, and I would say this is not exclusive to the United States, this is not exclusive to child mental health, this kind of a backfire effect is observed in a lot of the issues that we work on. Essentially what the field have been doing for a very long time is using what you all know as nonprofit leaders are very valuable communications resources in a way that not only wasted those resources for no effect, but actually used those resources in a way that directly disadvantaged their very goals as advocates, as experts, as practitioners, as researchers on these issues. So hopefully by this point, you all realize that framing matters, and it matters a great deal. It's not inconsequential, beautiful sounding adornments of ideas, but rather can be the difference between whether our ideas get through, whether they stick, and whether they have the effect that we want them to have. And so now I'm going to take you quickly through these 6 ideas that I think are really important in the current context. And the first idea is the way that we, and I think you all know this, so I want to be really clear at the beginning that nothing that I'm about to say is original. I think everyone at some level will have thought about these ideas, and my role is kind of, rather than to be novel and creative, it's to pull ideas that you're all having in some area of your mind kind of to the forefront and focus our attention on them. But it is incredibly important right now. The decisions are incredibly important right now in terms of how we're talking about individuals and government. So we've seen, and these are findings that generalize outside of the COVID pandemic context, is that when we are not careful and we allow frames of government to be kind of constructed around ideas of, government is broken, government is inept, government is incapable, even though some of these things may actually be true of some of our governments, the result, the resulting takeaway in terms of public audiences is that people become very fatalistic, that government can ever, that the institution of government can ever do anything of meaning, of impact. They become very likely to focus more on individual actions and decisions, take their focus off of, and kind of the attention to systems becomes diluted. And then you see these ideas of privatization really being able to gain ground and traction. So we have done a lot of work in the United States around issues of education reform, where you see this kind of framing on the left is super rife among progressive advocates. And we have great research and documentation of its effects in producing the kind of things that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. The other frame that I think is really interesting around kind of individuals in government that we've been seeing a lot of is this kind of heroic individual framing, normally around individuals who are actually doing heroic things in clinical and healthcare settings, or a focus on charitable donations. And so my critique here is not in saying that these things that you see on the left-hand side of the screen are not true. My critique is that if our attention narrowly focuses on the actions of individuals, there's a set of things that happens in terms of our thinking about systems and government. If individuals are framed as the way that change and solutions happens, what happens is that we let our eyes off of the role of government, and we become hyper-focused on decisions and willpower and grit and gumption and drive of individuals, and obscure the role that government has to play, can only play when it comes to these kinds of major public health crises that we're dealing with. And then on a good note, and you're seeing quite a bit of this as well, I did a webinar with a couple of 100 Australians yesterday, where this kind of framing that you see, this third type, is really gaining traction. So framing government as responsible, as playing a unique and necessary role, and emphasizing the need for government to be held responsible and accountable for what it is and what it isn't doing. And when you see that kind of framing repeated, you see a dramatically different type of kind of public thinking and response. Individualism is balanced and tempered, and people begin to expect, to demand, kind of build will around requests for government to actually do the things that it has to do as government. So the takeaways here, the what to do's, are to be really clear in explaining the unique role that government has, that government and only government can play in these kinds of situations that we are in, to make very clear calls for increased government action, but not just blind kind of blanket statements about the need for government action, but to be able to hold government accountable and responsible for what it does and doesn't do. And I think this is related to that, to be really specific about what government needs to do, but also to be critical about when those things that it needs to do are not being done. and really this strong idea of the need to hold government accountable. This is a really important one. In the way that we hold government accountable, I think it is really important not to occlude, not to obscure the fact that government can do these things. So as soon as all we are is critical, people become very fatalistic in their view that government actually can do these things that it needs to do. So in our tone and our positioning, it needs to be clear that government is accountable and needs to be held responsible, but also to convey a sense that these are things that government can and should do. And finally, to repeat. If you think about all of the framing around heroic individuals and the repetition of that, it's not surprising that our focus gets so easily kind of distracted and taken off of government. And so we need to put these frames around government responsibility, government action, unique role kind of on repeat and on a spin cycle such that people can have a consistent diet of this really different way of thinking about government. This is a really important one, I think, in the work that you all are doing. It's incredibly hard in the moment to do this, and this is really comes from a lot of really good cognitive science research that shows clearly that when we repeat what we want people to forget, we disadvantage the ideas that we're trying to advance, right? And so when we frame issues around the negative case that we're trying to push back against, and we give that negative case inadvertently space and real estate in our communications, we create a backfire effect, right? Those beliefs actually gain air, they breathe, they exercise in people's minds, and they become stronger as a result of us refuting them. And instead, if we are able to frame issues whereby we advance our issue and talk about what needs to happen, rather than continually referencing the negative case that we're pushing back against, this is when you see kind of new narratives being able to emerge. We're able to advance our idea, and we don't inadvertently reinforce and reify the thing that we are contesting. Like I said, it's pretty easy when you see this on the screen right now to say, oh yeah, I want to do the one on the bottom. But I think in the moment, when we're in a contested narrative and framing space, it's exceedingly difficult to have the kind of discipline to not engage with the idea that we want to kind of push to the back of people's thinking. And there's really good work around this. Julie's seen this before, but a lot of the work that is critical of kind of myth-fact constructions, and a lot of this work exists in public health. So you can see this graphic here right now. This is a myth-fact sheet from the CDC. And people have studied this exact myth-fact sheet, exposing large representative samples of Americans to this sheet, and then querying them afterwards to figure out kind of what effect it had on their thinking. And the result of this and many other studies like it is that people misremember the myths as true, and that effect gets actually worse the further they are in time away from having seen the communication. And that the really detrimental thing is that they end up attributing the myth that they now think is true to the source of the communication. So again, it's just this cognitive principle is we can't start with the thing that people already believe, give it a chance to kind of invigorate and activate, and then think that we can just come right behind it with the corrective. And so the what to do's here are to kind of, I mean, a lot of this is about ordering. So ordering is an incredibly potent and powerful concept with framing. Instead of leading with the idea that we're refuting and then coming with our idea, what you want to do is switch that. So you want to lead with the thing that you want to advance and try very hard not to take the bait, even though as kind of logical and analytic people, it becomes really hard to do that when we're up against ideas that we fundamentally don't believe in. Not just to advance your idea, but to make people smarter about it in some way, to explain how it works, to explain why it matters. And then, and only then, and only if you need to, is it appropriate to kind of double back to the misinformation or the misperception and try to debunk it. So this set of recommendations is heavily about ordering. It's about starting with where you want to take people and avoiding starting with where you want to move people from. The third idea is to think really carefully. So this is where a lot of these ideas around vulnerability will come in. Think really carefully about how we position groups. As I've talked about, when we frame groups who have particular needs as vulnerable, we really allow ourselves and the people we're communing with to create immediate kind of distinctions between us and them, to otherize, to inadvertently reify stereotypes of certain groups as, and I don't believe this, but as kind of weak or lazy or somehow less than the rest of us. This framing we've seen a lot in the United States, this kind of saviors and victims framing. And again, I think this is well-intentioned, but the way in which this kind of framing, in which certain groups are positioned as being less than or lower than other groups, powerfully re-ingrained stereotypes and stigmas. And the only thing that you can think about from a savior and victim frame is that a group must sacrifice for another group, which I think is a really unproductive way of thinking about interdependence. And then kind of most subtle among them, and we've seen a lot of this in the way that people have communicated in the United States around issues of aging and older adults, a lot of these appeals to the worthiness and deservingness of a certain group of people. And once you've kind of locked your frame into worthiness, you invite people to evaluate the deservingness of a group of people. And that is a really dangerous and unproductive place to be when it comes to situations of crisis. The recommendations here are, so there's a recommendation and then there's a thing not to do in parentheses, just to be clear, is that interconnection can and is being framed as a strength rather than a liability. Rather than certain groups are kind of pulling the rest of us down, there's a way of framing interconnection and interdependence as a strength and attribute. Instead of some of us having to sacrifice for others of us, we can think about the way that each and every one of us has a responsibility to all of us. And that's just a really different, even spatially, that's a really different way of framing relationships between groups and kind of collective. There is a way that we can, instead of emphasizing how different other groups are, we can try to connect and build on common shared experiences, emotions, and this can be really powerful. There's a way of, instead of sacrificing and saving being our kind of charitable frame, which I think is really unproductive, there's a way of appealing to everyone to step up and do the right thing, rather than having to save or bail out certain groups of people. The fourth idea is a really important one, and I think this one is one that everyone can take out of this call here today and apply right away when you go back to your work. Is that there's really strong findings, again, this is primarily from work of social psychologists, that find that when our message is overwhelmingly about crisis and urgency and very thin in terms of solutions and things that can be done, people become immediately fatalistic. They see this as a problem about which nothing can be done, and the result is a very quick, kind of without hesitance, disengagement with an issue. Unfortunately, when we're all about solutions and we present kind of an overly rosy, hopey-changey kind of image, you have another problem, which is people don't see the situation as being particularly urgent, and aren't willing to engage. And I think in a context where there are real problems, being overly rosy about solutions can just seem very tone deaf, and we've seen a lot of messages actually outright rejected because they fall into this trap. But if we are able to create frames and messages that balance a sense of problem and urgency with an equally robust sense of solutions and efficacy, we can kind of pull forward and build on people's sense of agency, that there are things that can be done. We can allow people to kind of engage with the issue in a productive way. We can motivate and mobilize action. So the recommendations are here. When you have a solution, bring it to the conversation. Solutions need to be powerful parts, concrete parts of your messages. It's not just enough to take a solution and kind of drop it into discourse, but rather our solutions need to be explained. We need to be explanatory in how we describe the way that a solution precipitates or leads to improvements and outcomes. This is an issue where tone really matters. There are strong tones of kind of crisis and urgency that are overwhelming to people, and instead our tone needs to be more pragmatic and balanced. We need to convey a sense that there are solutions that would make the world better or would address our issues rather than just more problems. And when it comes to the pandemic, I think it's really important that, again, we don't go kind of overly hopey changey, but that it really is important that we connect with how hard things are, the difficulties that people face. And so it's important as we realize the role and power of talking about solutions, that we don't go too far in that direction, but rather that we do need to engage people around urgency. So we're almost there. The fifth idea is about how we frame the change that we are moving into in a post-COVID context. And I've been collecting a lot of these kinds of frames and communications that people are using to kind of talk about the importance of now for later, or in the long term, in the medium term, and lots of framing. And I'm sure everyone has seen this kind of combative, adversarial win, kind of war metaphors, that we need to seize the moment and win this particular fight. And when that happens, it's an incredibly easy and immediate invitation for people to kind of default into their senses of polarization and partisanship, to view this as competition, and to become really resistant to engaging with these kinds of issues. There's also a lot of framing, and these are the ones that I kind of cringe at, around the pandemic having bright spots or silver linings. And I think that certainly in the United States, in the moment that we are in, and I imagine in many other places, this just sounds horribly tone deaf. It sounds opportunistic, and the result is that these kind of messages can backfire in some really powerful ways that have longer term effects in terms of how people think of an organization or a cause. And then the other one that you see a lot of, which I think is a little more subtle, is this: we need to blow up the system, we need to reinvent the structure, we need to change everything. And I think that especially in times of anxiety and stress, the idea that we need to change everything is absolutely overwhelming to most people, and again leads really powerfully to that ability to become fatalistic and the desire to disengage with a message. So the takeaways here are to talk about responding and supporting, but not some of these more strategic sounding things like take advantage or leverage. The importance of going forward together rather than these kind of competition or adversarial frames. The incredible power of being aspirational and talking about what is possible and desirable rather than just the kind of negative problems that we're moving from. And then to not forget these solutions that we've just talked about in the previous idea of urgency and efficacy. And so the last idea, and this is a quick one and I'll just leave you with it, and I'm sure most of you are thinking about this, but while not talking about silver linings or bright spots or winning or leveraging, it is the case that the way that we frame our issues now is going to determine what is possible in terms of solutions and ideas later. This has been the case kind of each and every major crisis or catastrophe, certainly in our country. If you go back to the Great Depression and the way that ideas were positioned, we were able to move from that to a really different sense of the role of government and intervention. 9/11 and the way that was framed, I would argue, has some very less productive and really problematic trends and legacies that it's presented to us in terms of othering and racism and Islamophobia, for one. But I think that there's a bunch of these issues that we all work on that are really in flux and in balance, and the way that we position our ideas on them is really important. So one that I think a lot about is role of government. The way that we talk about government now is really going to be important in setting up what people are able to think about going forward. In the United States, issues of health equity are really up for discussion and debate in some really important ways. Issues around data and privacy and artificial intelligence in the course of public health efforts are kind of bubbling up and are open for framing. Issues of education and learning, really important, and ideas are swirling. And then I think probably one of the most important ones, how we think about the economy and work and labor are certainly issues that are that are salient and really contingent and open to the way that we frame them. And so I'm just going to end with one of my favorite quotes about framing, which is from, I think he identifies himself as a philosopher, I'm not sure, this guy named Charles Eisenstein from Boston, who said, "The world as we know it is built on a story. To be a change agent is first to disrupt the existing story of the world, and second to tell a new story of the world so that people have a place to go." And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hopefully we'll get Julia back up here, and we're going to take some questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for bearing with me. I guess you didn't have a choice, but thank you all for staying with me through that. I hope that was interesting and helpful. And I'd love to, and I know Julia would love to hear your questions as well. And Julia and I will both try to provide some perspective on any questions that you all have. Thank you very much. You're muted, Julia.
Not anymore.
There you go.
Thank you so much, Nat. It was fantastic. And we did have several questions that popped up during the presentation. And so I'll kind of ping those. And then, you know, if folks have questions as we're talking, please put them in the chat. I'm going to start with asking my own question, just for the thinking what the audience might be thinking, this international audience. Of all of these lessons that you just discussed, what is the role of kind of different countries' contexts? Like, as you know, a lot of the examples are coming from the United States. A lot of the research maybe that you've done has been in the UK and Australia and the US. And so for the folks that are coming from, you know, totally different parts of the world, you know, I think might want to hear just, is this relevant? I think it's totally relevant and universal, but I think if you could talk about that. And let me just give you a couple more quick questions and I'll let you address them at the same time. You know, there was an observation about your first point about the role of government and the responsibility of government. And, you know, we have a lot of human rights workers on the call with us, and folks who are very focused on a rights-based message of inalienable individual rights. And so if you could kind of talk a little bit about you know, that first importance of government, and then how we kind of maybe tie in a human rights frame to that lesson. You know, and also what it looks like to be an advocate for vulnerable groups when we're not calling them vulnerable. And we're, you know, and so there's a lot of, you know, good work of people who do think that there's a portion of society that need advocates for policies. And so if you could maybe talk a little bit more about like being in that space of advocating. And I'll just leave you with those 3 questions. There's a couple of more, but why don't you try and address those?
Those are great questions. Do we have another 3 hours here? those are really good. And so I will apologize at the beginning that I probably won't do any of these questions the justice they deserve. They're really important questions. So I'm just going to do my best to comment really briefly on the 3 of them. If people are interested, maybe there's a way that we can have an extended conversation about these. So I think I'll try to do them in the order that you asked them, Julie. I think the universal specific one is a really good question, and always a tricky one to ask an anthropologist who will never say that anything is universal. Certainly someone like myself who was kind of trained at the zenith of postmodernism. But I think that each of these kind of 5 recommendations, the last one's really not a recommendation, has components that are generalizable across context, but also dimensions that are specific to context. So for example, I think the idea of urgency and efficacy is a fairly generalizable finding. There's been lots of work done in different countries across the world that shows this to be kind of a common cognitive principle. The ways, however, that you evoke urgency and crisis and kind of resonance and the ways in which you talk about efficacy and solutions are going to be contextually different, right? So the same way that I would build a message right now about racial violence that has urgency and efficacy components is going to be very different from how advocates in Kenya working on closing civic space are going to have to position their messages. But I think that kind of there is at a high level, that general principle, it does generalize. And then as you get kind of more specific into the way that you instantiate or build messages that do that, that's where it becomes incredibly contextually relative, and even kind of more segmented even than that. The way that you evoke these messages to particular groups in particular national contexts is going to be different between groups. And so I think you could have a conversation kind of where you try to pull apart the generalness and the specificness of each of these recommendations that I've made. I think another great example would be the not leading with the thing that you want people to forget. Like that's a common cognitive, that's the way our cognitive systems work. But again, the way that you articulate that when it comes to communications is going to be and has to be different.
So, you know, Nat, can I jump in
please.
And just say, you know, when I'm in my international audiences talking about this, you know, one of the messages I would leave with this group is just to have an awareness of how you're communicating, and to study up, just so I feel like the very act of knowing, no matter what country you're in, to not take for granted that the way that it makes sense to you to communicate doesn't make sense to everyone else, that is a generalizable, just to like stop and think is a very powerful lesson. And to just take this and like think about it, all of the lessons. So
yeah,
I just wanted to say,
no, I mean, I think that's really good.
Awareness.
There's these two kind of, even at an even more meta level than what I've been talking about. There's these two ideas that I hope everyone, irrespective of whether you're in Georgia or I don't remember where other people are from, Colombia,
Mexico,
are really important. So one, as you just said, and when I say this, everyone's going to go like, oh, duh, of course I don't think that. But then you fall back into it when you communicate, is that you are not your audience.
Yes.
There's a Canada here. There's a Canada. I grew up in Montreal, so Canada. So if we can kind of bring that really explicitly to our thinking and constantly remind ourselves that we are not our audience, that the messages that resonate for us and kind of bring us to the dance may not be the same messages that bring the people that we need to come to the dance. And the second one is that just this most general recognition of, you know, what we have to say matters a great deal, but so does how we say it. And so being really intentional and thoughtful in all of these choices that we're making about what we include and what we don't include in our communications is a really productive kind of filter that we should bring to our communications.
So we've got 7 minutes left, and I really want to make sure that you talk about human rights and vulnerability advocacy.
Yep, okay, I'll stop. That's good. You gotta, you know this, Julia, you gotta rein me in. I'll get going on any one of these things and I won't stop. So I think the individual, I'm not sure I quite know the full extent of this question, but so I think there's a really interesting, so the people who work on human rights, obviously the position is that there are these inalienable things for each and every individual that each and every individual must have. And so there's a way in which that can kind of feel like it's an individual conversation. It's kind of like in that individual frame, but I would argue that in order for those rights to be institutionalized and acknowledged and implemented and upheld, there's a systemic and structural part of that, right? And I think the best analogy is this incredibly live, I have another call after this right now where I'm going to be talking about this, but this distinction between thinking about racism and our tendency to think about it as this individual level thing, that the problem is a couple of bad cops in the system. And it's easy for us to think about that, and it feels kind of comfortable and rewarding, like, oh, it's just evil people. If we could get them out, that'd be fine. But I think all of us, or most of us on this call, would realize that may be part of it, but that's not the issue, right? It's systems that are built in ways that perpetuate racism. So yes, there may be people with there may be racist cops, but the system is racist. And so I think that it's really important not to get stuck in this kind of individual perspective in thinking about these issues, even though individuals are affected. Like I'm not going to go super wonky and make this just all about systems, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge both an individual and kind of a more system governmental level to these issues. And it's much harder to frame and communicate about that system level thing. Like, have you seen people, if anyone's following the US news, anytime someone is kind of pushed to talk about what systemic racism is, it's really hard to do. And it's super easy to talk about how an individual is behaving in racist ways. So I guess that's just, I don't know if that's helpful, but it's kind of
it's almost a both
to you
and so I think, I mean, what I've been learning is that, because of course the other thing is we're taught about individual storytelling. I mean, that we're taught that you get under people's skin by telling a story about individuals and the, you know, the human rights that we all possess. And so I've at least learned that it's not an either or. You can tell the individual story, you can talk about the rights, and then also tie it into the systemic frame at the same time, and not to forget that part. So then what about advocating for vulnerable populations without
I just one more thing. I think people in the chat box are kind of acknowledging the both and perspective. There's Jennifer who's saying kind of human rights are collective and address structural inequality. So I guess the framing perspective is just not to go with the kind of individual perspective that may feel easier to articulate in a communication, but kind of always try to do the both and how you're communicating. So I'm gonna give you about the vulnerability thing. I'm gonna give you an organization who I think does incredibly good work on this. It's called the Perception Institute. So they do a lot of work. It's primarily around implicit bias. It's primarily around kind of race and racism, but they do a lot of really good work that's critical around vulnerability, but that provides some nice kind of correctives and, you know, if not that, then what? And so I would encourage you all to check them out. They're fantastic. Someone just put the URL, the website in the chat box. Thank you very much, whoever that was. And so there's a way in which, and I'm going to do a horrible job of this because unfortunately it's really complicated. Like anything else that's worth doing, it's really complicated. But there's a way in which we can talk about the vulnerabilities and kind of fuel the perceptions, the negative perceptions that people have of certain groups. There's also a way that we can focus more, and aspirational isn't quite the right word, but we can focus more on what we want to see for society, for groups of people. And that may sound a little kind of wonky and technical, but it's a really different way of positioning. So I can focus on all of the health problems that communities of color experience at inordinately higher rates than white communities. Or I can talk about the way in which communities of color can be healthy and experience positive outcomes, and the way that we all need opportunities to be healthy. So those are dramatically different ways into a conversation. And a lot of this is also about ordering. Leading with vulnerability rather than leading with what you want to see are really different. But even leading with what you want to see doesn't mean that you can't, after that, become critical and talk about differences in outcomes. But just think about how many times.
Too rosy, like you said, and then not being too hopey, changey. It's a real balancing act, isn't it? All right. Well, Nat, listen, we're 1 minute away from 11 o'clock. We could be talking about this for hours and hours. One quick thing, can you mention the scholar who did the myth busting? You were talking about the CDC and you said the name of somebody really fast. Do you remember who you mentioned? And if not, we'll just send it out afterwards.
Yes, so there's the main guy who does the myth busting kind of misperception correction work is a guy named Norbert Schwartz. He's at University of Michigan.
Schwartz.
He may be at USC now, but when he did that work, it was at University of Michigan. And then there's another political scientist at Dartmouth called Brendan Nyhan, Nyhan. who's done some really interesting kind of evolving work about how to correct misperceptions. His work is great.
And then, so there was a question about getting more information on framing. And so we always follow up these webinars with an email that will have this video attached to it and your slides, and we'll compile some framing resources. Obviously, you've got a ton of stuff on your website right now that is full of examples. So please, everyone, check out, the Frameworks website. But we will send out a note, or a follow-up email with everything. So now, thank you so much. It was inspiring as always. You're great. Keep up doing the wonderful work. We're all soaking it in and trying to apply it as best we can.
That's great. Thank you all very much. Everybody frame on, okay? Have a good one.
Frame on. All right. Bye-bye, Nat.